This video is brought to you by me. If you like what you see, please consider subscribing and pledging your support on Patreon so I can afford to pay my bills and give my cat a break from powering my computer. You know, it isn't easy being transgender. Even considering the internal factors such as gender dysphoria, the biggest challenges trans people face are always found on the societal level as people refuse to acknowledge our humanity, use us as convenient scapegoats for political agendas, attempt to exclude us from public spaces, and, of course, refuse to acknowledge our gender identities. And while society trends progressive and in general people have grown far more accepting of us, the fact that we rely on the acceptance of the greater majority to even stay safe, let alone pursue our own happiness, is no small cause of stress and sorrow. Science and psychology are both unequivocally on our side, of course, but when you have to deal with the general public and their, let's be honest, usually at best largely uninformed opinion on us, sometimes I feel it would be nice if some greater, unimpeachable authority would weigh in on our side. Even if we know who we are, it would still be nice to receive that kind of validation, wouldn't it? Well, what if there was? Enter the supernaturally validated trans person trope. The supernaturally validated trans person is a very fun and also fairly rare trope that involves some greater force, such as a god or a spell or the very essence of magic itself, directly corroborating the gender identity of a trans or non-binary character in such a way that it leaves zero room for argument or interpretation. Or to put it more simply, the magic says you're valid. It's important to note that this trope is completely different from the unfortunately named gender bender trope, which is actually about sexual characteristics and not an individual's gender identity. Sex and gender are not the same thing, and this trope is specifically about validating the character's gender identity. The SVTP can occur in a multitude of different ways, such as a magic mirror that shows them as their true gender, or someone who can see souls acknowledging that they have a soul that matches their gender identity. But it can also take the form of gender-locked magical abilities, or gaining magical seventh son or daughter powers, or even directly result in them unknowingly and accidentally fulfilling a prophecy as a side effect of being who they are. Trans people actually present a hilariously high potential for prophecy twists, which I honestly think more writers should lean into. No man of woman born has way more loopholes than Shakespeare realized, because if Macduff had been a trans woman, Macbeth would have been just as dead, and the same would be true if he was the son of a trans man. And there's also the comedic potential in a trans man trying and failing to stab a guy to death, crying and laughing at the same time because, while it's fucking great to have your gender identity validated, you still really need this fucker dead, and now is literally the worst time for that to happen. And don't even get me started on the potential a non-binary person has in messing with gendered prophecies. The possibilities are fucking endless. Name magic is probably the most common variation of the SVTP. A lot of mystic importance tends to be placed on the concept of a true name, which normally means a person's full name granted to them at birth. However, the idea of that true name conflicts with the existence of a dead name, and in stories that involve trans people and name magic, using the dead name pretty much always fails because that's not their fucking name anymore, and it's almost always badass. For more serious examples, you have Xanth Zhao from Spirit World, whose mother tries to wrap them with binding talismans that fail because the name she inscribed on them just doesn't apply to who they are, or a villain from The Dreaming Waking Hours who straight up starts choking on his own blood when he tries to use Heather's dead name against her. Side note, I actually really love how Spirit World censors Xanth's dead name. That's just a wonderful level of respect to show them. For a more comedic example though, you can look at Space Dread from the comic Val and Isaac, who just shoots a warlock in the face after he tries the same tactic. Val and Isaac is actually really fucking good and has one of my favorite non-binary jokes ever. I'll link to the maker's Tumblr down below, be sure to give them some love. Name magic is honestly one of the easiest and best ways to validate your trans character, because a name is a core aspect of identity, and it demonstrates that the person you truly are is more important than what people wanted you to be. And a trans person's chosen name is essentially the official stamp of recognition for that self-sought identity. It won't work with every character, since plenty of non-binary people keep their birth name, but it's still a solid choice. You can also sometimes find somewhat meta versions of the SVTP in the form of game mechanics reinforcing a character's gender identity. I'm sure there are more examples, but I can only really find two while I was making this video. The first being from the Fate Grand Order games, where the non-binary characters like Enkidu won't be affected by skills that target specific genders, and can also both give and receive chocolate for the Valentine and White Day events, which is pretty neat. And the second is from Pokemon, though I'm only really counting it because it makes me laugh. A few non-gendered Pokemon such as Cryogonal can learn Attract, despite the fact that it always fails because the moon only works on Pokemon of the opposite gender, and it also fails when used by a gendered Pokemon on them, which I think is very funny. Someone should make a video on non-gendered Pokemon, I bet that would be interesting. I think one of my favorite examples of the supernaturally validated trans person comes from the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina in the form of Theo Putnam, a character that actually gets supernaturally validated twice. Theo is a trans man, and before he even comes out, Roz's grandma, the local blind seer character, calls him a handsome fella, which he really likes, and it leads to him accepting his identity. Then later on in the final season, an incubus is exorcised from another character, and the moment it's announced that it will seek out a source of masculine energy, it flies directly to Theo, which is honestly kind of great. I mean, it's dangerous, but it's still cool that he's got just that much masculine energy. As I said, there are plenty of ways to go about supernaturally validating your trans characters, and there aren't any rules that say you can only do it once. It's also worth noting that this trope is very old. The oldest example I found was from Ide et Olive, I think I said that right, a 13th century French epic poem about Ide, a princess who escapes from the incestuous abuse of her father and travels disguised as a man, a persona that becomes more and more a part of his identity until he eventually aids in the defense of Rome and is rewarded by being given the hand of Olive, the local ruler's daughter, in marriage. Ide confides in Olive, who accepts him and agrees to keep it a secret, but the ruler finds out and attempts to expose and execute him before an angel appears, reveals that Ide's sex has been physically changed, blesses their marriage, and is implied to condemn their ruler to death. The two then go on to conceive a child and live happily ever after. It's good stuff. I'll link to a translated manuscript below for those who want to read it. So before we talk about implementation, I think it's important to discuss why, despite being literally older than print, you really just don't see this trope very often. This is actually one of the rarest queer tropes in modern media, and there are a couple of reasons behind that. The first reason is probably kind of obvious, but it's because trans characters are still fairly rare. We're getting more transgender and non-binary characters and even stories now due to increased visibility and understanding, but the fact is that a lot of people just aren't very comfortable trying to write a story that they don't feel is theirs to tell. You don't need to be trans to write a trans character, but to do it well you do need some level of familiarity. And you also need to actually want to write a trans story. And people who fulfill both criteria are relatively rare. So take that already small pool of people and then remove all the ones who aren't writing fantasy or supernatural stories, and it's really no wonder the trope is barely seen or known. The second reason, and this is where we run into a bit of an actual problem, is that pulling off this trope requires you to explicitly acknowledge that a character isn't cisgender twice over. Once to establish that they're trans, and the second time to have an in-story entity or force validate that. And this is only a problem because a lot of modern writers are weirdly averse to being explicit about their LGBT representation. Part of this is due to the idea that the best representation is subtle and implicit, but it's also partially due to fear of backlash. We live in a time where the outrage economy means it's never been easier for a bunch of greasy shit monkeys to get attention for having a histrionic meltdown over the inclusion of LGBT characters, and that kind of extremely toxic feedback can be very hard for creators to deal with. But what people need to understand is that sometimes you just need to say the quiet part out loud. Sometimes, if you want to have good representation, you need to have the character just say outright what they are so the topic can be properly addressed, and so that people can see themselves represented without the implication that it needs to be hidden. There will always be an asshole on the internet throwing a tantrum over the fact that gay people exist, but the existence of those people should not scare you away from making an openly trans or non-binary character. They're loud, but they're also very much in the minority, and the good you'll do and the joy you'll bring will far outweigh any amount of impotent rage these pathetic losers can hope to generate. If you want to use the supernaturally validated trans person trope, you need to first narratively validate them, and that means saying in no uncertain terms that they are trans. You are not required to specifically say the words transgender or non-binary, but you do need to make their gender identity abundantly clear. Right, so with that out of the way, how might you work this into your story? Well, that really depends on how you want to go about it, but let's run down a list of ideas. Aside from the true name thing we've already covered, there's also the option of the true self or the soul being used to validate the character's gender identity. The simplest way to do this would probably be to ascribe a gender-dependent color to the soul, like if a man's soul is orange and a woman's soul is green, for example, then you might make the soul of a gender-fluid person a swirling mixture that features one color more prominently depending on their feelings at the time, or an agender person might have a soul of an entirely different color, or even no color at all, depending on how you choose to interpret it. For a more complicated option, you might also write the soul goal is reflecting their true self and appearance, which might take the form of their ideal body or just have a silhouette that leans in a more masculine or feminine way depending on their gender identity. Additionally, if the character has died, you might have their spirit appear as their true gender, something the Sandman comics did with Wanda, which actually leads us to the next way you might validate their gender: divine acknowledgement. In the Sandman comic, Wanda's parents bury her with her dead name on her tombstone, but not only does her spirit take on the feminine form she wished she could have in life, but Death herself also acknowledges her as a woman, which is really awesome considering Death has been around just a teeny bit longer than transphobia has, and has a lot more to say on the truth than the assholes do. Obviously, you don't need to kill off a trans or non-binary character to have some form of divinity validate them, and it's really better that you don't, but if that's the route you choose to go with the character and you avoid the bury your gays trope, it's entirely possible to pull it off. If gods exist in the world of your story and are prone to interacting with mortals, then an easy option is to have a god greet the trans character as their proper gender, maybe even being the first person to call them my son or my daughter if they're binary trans, or using gender-neutral terminology if they're non-binary. Something else you could do, and this is something I really feel is a missed opportunity, is have the god in question not be of the gender people had thought. Gods of all mythologies tend to change their shape and gender to suit them, and it's a common occurrence for information on the oldest ones to be lost. It's entirely feasible that a god in your setting either changed their gender recently and decided to stick with it, or even that their true gender has been lost to time and that they've been worshipped in a flawed capacity because of that. Hell, if you want to get especially introspective about it, you could have the god and one of your characters both be non-binary, but have the culture surrounding them insist that non-binary people don't exist, despite worshipping a god that is proof of the thing they claim doesn't exist. The culture's insistence on misgendering said god wouldn't just be a golden opportunity to connect them to your character, it would also present a biting critique of how certain real-life religions pick and choose aspects to care about to further their own agendas. There's a lot of potential here that I feel gets overlooked because people tend to think too rigidly when it comes to gender. You can also have a seer type character correctly identify the character's gender if you don't feel like direct contact with the gods is a feasible option. Seers and oracles tend to be associated with divinity already, so if you prefer, it can offer a more grounded option for your story. Another fairly common option is the gender restricted ability. This often comes in the form of things like only the female members of a family being able to use magic, or only the male members of a family inheriting some kind of genetic superpower, and the way to supernaturally validate the character is obvious with these, but it does come in a variety of other interesting forms. One example is the webcomic Magical Boy, where trans boy Max inherits magical girl powers from his mom, complete with frilly transformation. But the powers and even the clothes begin to change to match his masculine presentation, which I really quite like. His gender isn't validated by failing to inherit the power, but by the power changing to match his gender identity. One particularly interesting example comes from the Wheel of Time series, where magic is split between the male Saidin and the female Saidar. One of the villains, Balthamel, was a man who was killed by the heroes and then later brought back to life as a woman named Arengar, by basically Satan as a punishment. However, he still drew on the power of Saidin, which is technically an affirmation of his gender identity. It's a weird example, but still kind of fun to think about. Finally, we should probably talk game mechanics. If you're making a game and it includes a trans or non-binary character that you want to supernaturally validate, you also have the potential to mechanically validate them as well, though how you go about this is largely going to depend on the game genre you're working with. A dating sim would have far different mechanics than an RPG, etc, etc. This is obviously a little more complicated than validating the character through writing alone, and aside from the chocolate giving mechanic in the Fates game I mentioned earlier and the attract thing, I can really only think of two potential ways to make it work. I'm sure an actual game dev would have more, but I'm just a writer. The first mechanical validation I can think of would be that if your game has gender restricted equipment for some reason, having your trans character only use the equipment of the correct gender. The easiest way to go about this would be to have your character using only the correct equipment from the start, so that it functions as a retroactive validation after the character reveals their trans status later on. But a far more interesting route would be to have the character come out as trans at some point in the story, and then have them switch from their old equipment to their new gender affirming version. You could also have a magic artifact that can only be used by one gender be usable by them both before and after they come out to demonstrate that they always were and will continue to be who they say they are. I don't know, I feel like there's potential there. The second involves abilities that either affect or can only be used by certain genders. I've already mentioned Attract from Pokemon, but charm effects in general can be used for this. Since they only tend to work on the opposite gender in most games for some reason, it would be an easy way to validate the character's identity. Actually, side note, I feel like there's a lot of really good comedic potential in attempting to use charm effects on LGBT characters, such as an incubus failing to seduce a lesbian, or both an incubus and a succubus becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to charm an ace person. I don't know, more stories should explore that. Another thing you could do would be to allow the trans character access to gender-locked classes as well. Some games have classes like Valkyrie or Lord that are female and male locked respectively, so having a trans man or trans woman able to reclass into those would be interesting. And it would also be fascinating to explore that from a non-binary perspective as well. I wonder what an agender-only class would look like. Oh yes, and don't feel that mechanical validation can only apply to video games. Tabletop RPGs are a wellspring of potential for trans validation. I actually experienced this myself once when playing D&D. The party was hit by a curse that rendered members of the opposite gender completely invisible to each other, which was causing a great deal of chaos in the moment before my DM remembered that my character was non-binary. He asked me what my gender was and I said nope, and after thinking for a moment he decided that I was the only one not affected by the curse, which was really fucking funny. Rem is a great DM, I love him a lot. But yeah, there's a lot of potential there. The supernaturally validated trans person is the rare case of an unequivocally positive queer trope, as it exists solely to place the author's support behind trans people and to allow the potential trans reader to feel both seen and validated themselves. But I do still want to caution people to be careful of how you implement this trope, because careless use can inadvertently send the message that there's only one correct way to be trans or non-binary. If, say, a story only validates trans people once they've transitioned, or a non-binary person if they dress and act a certain way, then it tells the audience that you can't be considered truly valid unless you match these criteria. It's very important to be cognizant of how your writing may be interpreted. Because the thing about art is that, whether you mean to or not, you will always be imparting a message onto the audience. And while you can't control how people will interpret your art, you can still take precautions to minimize the potential damage caused by well-intentioned carelessness. The supernaturally validated trans person is a very fun trope that sends an important message. It says, who you are is not wrong, and everyone else should see that to be true. And I think that's a message worth sending and hearing. So, yeah.